Hello everybody and welcome back. In today's video we're going to be talking about the practices of war and their impacts on the outcome, technological developments, land. So everything we're going to be talking about today is the developments, which means a new and refined idea or product, and land, warfare that is fought on shifting terrain, on movable terrain, because when we think of air warfare, it's you moving around the environment almost unhindered. Land warfare, you have to struggle with the ever-changing scope, ever-changing way the land shifts, whether it's holes from explosives, mud, rain, all of the different types of environments. So everything that we're going to talk about today is all about how the different technologies that were used in the land, on whether they were impactful for the end of the war. Now, this is going to be the biggest part where we're going to see the most development, because at its core, the way technology dictated the war was plain and simple. It was that we needed both sides, the Germans, the French, the Russians, the British, the Americans, everyone needed to get this man out of his trench to kill him. So whether we get him out on his own accord, whether he rushes us, whether we throw an explosive down there, or whatever we figure out. The way to always think about technological developments on the land is getting soldiers out of trenches. So there's constant development of technology that will then also counter each other on trying to either keep the soldier in the trench or get them out of there. And this is a really nice cross-section as just a reminder of what trench warfare was actually like here. So trench warfare was creating a dug-down position so that enemy fire can just continue to go on and you're constantly safe, being able to move back and forwards. There was protection with barbed wire, places to rest so you can shoot your gun as accurately as possible. Keeping your ammunition high so it wouldn't get wet. Standing there so that you would fire, which means even if you weren't standing on that step, the enemy would not see you. Keep you above water that would collect, and then places where you could rest further underneath the ground. So everything we're going over today is to get these guys out of the trench. The first that we're going to address is gas. Gas warfare is one of the most talked about styles of warfare with World War I. And this is because although gas has been used in war before, although chemical warfare, which is what this is considered, chemical warfare has been used before in war, it has not been used on the style and scope that we see in the First World War, which is why a lot of the times people credit the First World War as the first time gas is used on a more larger global scale rather than isolated attacks. So we see this being used at the Second Battle of Ypres, at the Battle of Austerlitz Fortress, also known as the Attack of the Dead Men. But this is used constantly after 1915. This is used in various different ways because the way gas warfare works is just like you see on the picture on screen. The men would release chlorine gas, which was the first gas that was used. Chlorine gas. And they would send this chlorine gas by the use of the wind, because chlorine gas is heavier and denser than air. So once it emits, it stays on the ground and wants to fill in the lowest positions as possible. So as they release and open these canisters, as you can see here, the wind will carry it, and because it's heavier, it'll follow along the trench, it'll follow along the ground until it finds dips. So once it comes over and finds a trench, right, so the gas is coming this way and it'll find a trench, it will seep in and fill that trench before moving on, before being pushed out. And in fact, once it got to the deepest part of the trench, it would not be able to get out unless someone used air to blow it out of the trench. So this warfare essentially crept gas in so that the men in the trenches would asphyxiate. They would choke. And they would either choke from a lack of oxygen as the chlorine gas filled their lungs and started to drown them, in a sense, in their own blood, or stand up to get out of the trench so that the enemy can have freely firing them as if shooting duck in a barrel or fish in a barrel. So because of this, the British and the French, who were the first victims of gas warfare by Germany, developed specific gas masks that would help block chlorine gas. And if you were quick enough, if you were fast enough, then you could put your gas mask on. Because remember, this is dependent on air. This is dependent on the movement of the wind. So if you saw it soon enough, you could put your mask on and block out most of the chlorine gas and suffer little to no issue. Well, because those masks were developed for chlorine, the Germans came up with a second style of gas, which then started eating away at rubber seals so that the gas would still get into the lungs, which started causing further damage to the eyes, nose, and lungs. And then when a new gas mask was created to prevent that, the Germans and the British created a third style of gas, which was even more lethal. So you get chlorine gas from the first time it's used, where it's these big yellow clouds of looming fog just rolling over the ground. And then eventually, at the very end of the war in 1918, you start getting something called phosphonogen gas, which was clear, which was odorless, and you could only tell once you inhaled it. That one was so dangerous because it would actively fill your lungs with your own blood. And despite the horrors and the scariest parts of this use of gas, it still amounts to less than 1% of the total deaths of the war because of the gas masks, because of this constant competition back and forwards. That the gas is getting soldiers out of the trenches, but the gas isn't killing them. It isn't lethal enough, not until it's, quite frankly, too late in the war. So gas kind of puts us in a weird position where, is it effective in killing? No. But is it effective of causing troops to retreat? Yes. So does not killing your enemy and letting them fight another day mean victory? If it means that you gain more territory, it's a very, very debated topic, especially since it wasn't very lethal. And this is going to be the exact same argument for the next technology, which is tanks. Tanks were used in the Battle of Somme and the Battle of Cambrai. The horrific Battle of Somme where several soldiers died, and the Battle of Cambrai where we see the first use of successful tanks. This success was because they were mobile armored units. They were fully covered on every side with machine guns. But with all of that, they were still unbelievably limited. They couldn't move very fast. They couldn't move very far. If they got stuck in mud, they would be stuck on a trench and could not move. The inside of them was so tight, both in space and in a rotation of air, that it was unbelievably hot and it was difficult for the soldiers to work in. And if someone rolled over gas, or if gas was initiated, essentially these became death traps because you could not escape. These tanks, although it was the first time they were ever used in the Battle of Somme, they were an immediate failure. Yet, when we get to the Battle of Cambrai, they were successful, except for the fact that at the end of the first day of the Battle of Cambrai, half of all of the tanks were destroyed. By the end of the second day, the remaining half is destroyed. So in 2 days, despite the fact that the British were able to move the furthest than they have ever moved in the entirety of the war, 3/4 of their entire tank battalion was gone. So we get, again, much like gas, this weird dynamic of, yes, they were effective, but also they weren't. And this is further shown in the artillery. Artillery was the first time it was really used on this style of warfare. Now, artillery is the usage of having cannons, rather than pointed face to face as you usually see in like the American Civil War. These were arced up so that your bombs would fly over your soldiers. They'd fly over your troops. So artillery was very efficient in the war. It was so efficient in the war, it made up for 70% of the deaths that occurred in this conflict. That 70% of these men dying came from bombs flying from the sky. Not only that, but some of these bombs could be changed and manipulated to show different styles of explosives. Some cases it was just a traditional explosives. In other cases they were filled with additional metal so that when it hit, it blew up and sent pieces of metal all across the trench. Or some of them were filled with gas so that you would get a mobile gas attack that wasn't dependent on the air. However, in spite of the fact that artillery did use and was successful enough to kill 70% of all of the troops in the war, it was also killing your own men, because you have to be very mathematically precise. You have to know your telemetry and your geometry. Otherwise, you're dropping bombs on your own troops. And that was exactly the case in World War I. This 70% doesn't mean the enemy only. The 70% includes men who were killed by their own artillery. Men who were killed by their own people because they did the math wrong. This artillery unit, or artilleries, were very, very successful and continue to be successful today. And in Serbia, in that small nation that shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, there's a new type of artillery. Grenades. Mobile explosives that can be thrown and be just as lethal. So much so that these small grenades, these small explosives, were almost deemed war crimes, just like gas was, just like bombers were at a certain point. The impact that we see of these artillery units and these grenades were very successful. So much so that, going back to the last slide, part of the reason why the tank failed in the Battle of Somme is as soon as that tank got stuck in the mud, it would be the perfect opportunity for soldiers with grenades or artillery units to just start raining explosives down upon it. They were sitting ducks. And if we knew that men were going to cross no man's land, all we had to do was wait. And as soon as we saw 2 or 3 of them get up and start running, we just tell our artillery guys, hey, fire at the same spot we've been firing for literal years, and we'll eliminate the enemy. And so this is really coming down to the same thing that I brought up at the beginning of the video. That all of land technology is focused on getting men out of the trenches. Whether it's by gas, by forcing them out under their own, whether it's by tank to be able to move over and roll over trenches to shoot them out, or by artillery and grenades, by just dropping explosives from the sky. It's this interesting development where the one strategy that every nation used of trenches spurred multiple types of developmental technology that will be revolutionary in future conflict. But in World War I, it's kind of tricky what is revolutionary, what isn't. And this brings up 2 questions. If you have new technology, if you have all these wonderful new death machines, if you don't have a strategy that matches it, are they effective? Are they useful? Does new mean good? Just because we have all this new shiny ways to kill each other, does that mean we're using them effectively? Right? Because as you see on this picture here, once men were getting out of the trenches, they were just running into machine guns, gas, artillery, grenades, and tanks, and many other things as well. So when you really think about World War I and the technological developments of land, you have to ask yourself, does new mean good?